COP26 is days away. It's a place where many people are hoping serious commitments will be made by governments around the world. But today, UN scientists say the latest commitments to cut emissions are not enough to stop severe climate breakdown. The UN Environment Programme's latest annual emissions report says the current plans reduce predicted emissions by less than 8%, but what's needed is more than 50%. This was the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
The Paris Agreement says that the provision of scaled-up financial resources should aim to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. And so, a balance means 50-50. And I repeat my call to donors and multilateral development banks to allocate at least 50% of their climate support towards adaptation and resilience. The clock is ticking. The emissions gap is the result of a leadership gap, but leaders can still make this a turning point to a greener future instead of a tipping point to climate catastrophe. The era of off measures and hollow promises must end. The time for closing this leadership gap must begin in Glasgow.
Tom Burke chairs the climate think tank E3G and was previously an advisor to the UK government on the environment. There have been so many stark warnings and stark phrases used about the environment, but I was struck by him saying this emissions gap will have to be closed by a leadership gap. Do you think that leadership gap can be closed in the next few days?
Well, I think we'll see, but he's absolutely right to focus on the leadership gap. What you've seen in this report is yet another message from the real world to the politicians that they're simply not doing enough to tackle a problem where we have the technology that we need to solve and we know we can afford to use it. And the real challenge, the real obstacle to getting on with solving it is the fact that politicians are not yet stepping up to the plate and providing the leadership that is necessary to deploy those technologies and to get on with the job.
What do you think is stopping them?
I think that they are trying to hold on to a comfortable present rather than deal with an uncomfortable future. Now, the problem is that, in effect, that means they're trying to argue with the physics of carbon in the atmosphere. And the one thing you can be reasonably confident about is that if it's an argument between physics and politics, the politicians will lose. So they're simply not using their ability to mobilize the resources of government effectively to deal with the problem. And it's a political failure. I mean, it's not a failure of our institutions. It won't be a failure of the UNFCCC if we don't go ahead. It won't be a failure of the rest of the world. The business community, both the finance and the corporate sector, are doing far more than is often recognized themselves. But they can't succeed in solving the problem unless the politics is with them, and it's not at the moment.
Sometimes politicians don't take courses of action because they think it'll be unpopular. I mean, in short, they'll get voted out. Do you think, I mean, you're not a politician, but do you think that might be a part of the issue here?
I think you're exactly right about that, Eddie, and I think there is a concern more to get the right headlines than to get the right outcome. But as we found out with the COVID, actually, it's amazing. The public, when they actually understand the problem, and my guess is they really do now understand the problem about climate change because of all the events that have happened over the last 2 years that people have experienced in their own lives and on television, is they're much more willing to do things and to go along with things and that actually deal with the problem. And that's certainly supported by the polling evidence. So quite a lot of it is a failure of nerve by politicians. But then when you have politicians who come from parties with only a few 100,000 members, maybe they know less than they think about the public will.
Thank you. That's Tom Burke, who chairs the climate think tank E3G.